This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special featured guest this evening, Dennis Cimino, where we're going to discuss the great moon landing hoax. Dennis, are you convinced, based upon your research, which I know has been very thorough and detailed, that we did not go to the moon?
Absolutely. Not a percentage under 100%. In other words, I'm 100% certain that we did not go.
I completely agree. 100%. We didn't go. It's ridiculous. Every line of argument leads to the same conclusion. I must say, I became first interested in this issue when my wife and I were staying at the Morgan Hotel in London, which backs onto the British Museum. I picked that hotel because her maiden name was Morgan. And as you know, British hotels, the rooms are very small. They had a TV, and on one of the BBC channels, they were showing the documentary Conspiracy Theory, Did We Go to the Moon? And it gave one scientific argument after another that we could not have gone to the moon. Van Allen belt, inadequate propulsion systems, incapacity for communication. I mean, it was really convincing, Dennis. But I became, terribly, terribly interested and pursued it to the extent that now I have a book with 4 chapters on the moon landing hoax entitled, "And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either," published in 2015. And I gather you were actually in the UK yourself and watched the moon landing as it was taking place.
That's correct. I was sitting in London in 1969, and I literally walked out of the room and went outside when I couldn't hear the rocket engine on the LEM firing on the way to the moon. And I was a little bit surprised that there was no audio during that. And at the very end of it, the astronaut confirmed that he had just now shut the engine off. There was no change in the audio, and that to me convinced me it was fake. And of course, my 2 British friends that lived approximately 1 street over there in Kenton, where I was at, they were perplexed as to why I got up and left until after everything was over. They came out and wondered why I got disgusted and left. So, but I saw it right away that it was a hoax, and to me it was much more disturbing because I was so young and I couldn't handle that,
Well, you were certainly prescient at 15-year-olds to determine that it had been a hoax because you couldn't hear the sound of the engine reverberating inside of the LEM.
Well, most people wouldn't pick up on stuff like that, but I'm pretty observant about all kinds of stuff going around me. I'd almost use the term hyper observant or hyper vigilant about stuff that happens in everyday life. It's not like I'm a robot or I can see better than other people, but when I see something that's blatantly not correct, I can pick up on it pretty quick. I'm not the Johnny come lately that comes around 3 or 4 years later and gets it. I see it right then, and I've always been like that, fortunately for me, but it's also almost been a curse because the other people around me just don't see the things, and then it causes a great deal of dissension then.
Now, Dennis, you're seeing the recording button flashing right in the upper corner.
It's just sitting there. Okay, now, yeah, I can see it. It's
okay,
blinking.
let's look at some of the arguments that are being made about the moon landing. Here's an Apollo fact, where the claim is made that there are no scientists in the world to refute the moon landings. That's balderdash. They list here those who support the moon landings as being genuine. Michael Shermer, American, he's the head of skeptics. He's not a scientist, to the best of my knowledge. In fact, he's a disinformation artist. I've had plenty of exchanges with him. I certainly am unimpressed by the idea that he should support the moon landing hoax. That's certainly a reasonable stance for him to be taking, given what I know about him. Professor Stephen Dutch, American, Brian Cox, British. I've heard of Cox somewhere. Harold Leach, German, a grand total of 4. But here's a list of scientists who support the hoax. James McCanney, American, I know him. I've actually interviewed him. He's a brilliant guy, very impressive. Luke Sargent, American. Andrei Balog, British. Colin Rourke, British. Krasimir Ivanov, Ivajinsky, Russian. I like those Russians, Dennis. Akihito Sojima, Japanese. Li Zifeng, Chinese. Professor Federico Martin Maglio, Argentinian. So by this assessment, there are 9 against and only 4 in favor. which is a ratio of approximately 69 to 31%, Dennis. But, today that situation has to have changed dramatically. I mean, I'm a professor of philosophy of science. I mean, I would certainly qualify as more qualified than Michael Shermer by any yardstick, and I'm, like you, completely convinced it was hocus pocus.
Yeah, when you look at the overwhelming facts in every single corner of this whole thing, it's absolutely certain, not probable, but certain that we never went, because of the large volume of fakery that was done ostensibly in a studio setting, mostly, and the intention by the apparently operation by the Central Intelligence Agency to deceive by omission with the lack of clarity in the pictures and the videos and film that was beamed back to the Earth allegedly. So what we have here is we have a very elaborate hoax, and just like a lot of horror movies, there's a great deal of suspense. They fabricated Apollo 13 to get the American public back on board because people were watching I Love Lucy more than they were watching any of this other garbage. That's a good reason, because it's not that it was boring. It was just that you couldn't really see much when you look at some of this stuff. It was all hat and no cattle. There was no real substance.
Right. I love that phrase. Yeah, all hat and no cattle. Well, let's look at some of these Apollo facts. Here's the first. Despite numerous videos being taken on the moon surface, not one of them contains any frame showing planet Earth in the void of space. That would appear to be very poor planning on the part of the astronauts, even though we already know why it's so, namely because they didn't go.
Right, and the one thing that is pretty clear, that when we look at images from allegedly the halfway point, and the fact that they actually had to do the fakery on the 18th and the 19th on days when they were supposed to have already been in lunar orbit already, but they were not. They were in lower Earth orbit. When they had to fake that shooting, and then they got the size ratio wrong. I mean, it's very clear that the Earth is very, very many times larger than the moon. And conversely, as you look up at the moon on a bright night, you have a full moon. The moon is rather large as far as in the sky. But just imagine how much bigger the Earth would look from the moon, because the Earth is larger. It's a larger body, and yet from the halfway point, they made the Earth look like it was fractional in size compared to the moon. As a matter of fact, if you would have believed that the ratiometrics that they used for that halfway shot, the Earth would look like a basketball, almost. But it's ludicrous. They didn't even do the basic computational stuff to get the math right, let alone to make sure that the imagery would be correct for the distances. So it's very, very clear to me that they didn't do the necessary homework. And we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get deeper into it here.
Sure, absolutely. Neil Armstrong suffered with mental illness in his later years, a direct result of him putting his name forward as the foundation stone for the biggest lie in history. Or could it be that he became paranoid by the overwhelming number of websites exposing him as a liar? And why was he buried at sea after his death? That's a fact of which I was unaware.
Yeah, that's a big puzzle to me, because if he was really a major hero, unless his family specifically said that they didn't want him in Arlington, it would have guaranteed that a person that allegedly was the first man to walk on the moon would have been buried in a prominent location in Arlington National Cemetery after his death, and unceremoniously dumping him in the ocean, just like they did to the fake Bin Laden corpse.
I know, according to that ridiculous story. Another hoax, by the way.
Right. What an ignoble end for a man that with two other gentlemen performed the most magical feat in the history of mankind, and yet they dump him in the ocean like garbage.
Well, Dennis, I would think that it would have been his preference, because he didn't want people to continue to honor him after death for something he didn't do.
Well, as you can imagine, the reason why these guys had to be very, very quiet. If you look at the press conference immediately after they did the mission, they were very troubled gentlemen.
Yes.
The fidgeting with the pen and the clipboard stuff, and the facial expressions on all the astronauts' faces. These weren't men that just performed the most incredible feat in the history of man. These were men that were troubled and vexed and under threat, probably, because they understood that there's bad things could happen if they didn't play along with the hoax. But they did not look like the kind of men that just would be just ebullient and joyous about the thing that they had just done.
Yes.
looked like men that were guilty as charged.
Yes. They looked very grim. They weren't euphoric. I mean, if you or I had walked on the surface of the moon, Dennis, it would be impossible to keep us from talking about it, explaining what it was like, sharing it with the rest of the world, because it would have been such a unique opportunity. But they looked surly, uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere else but there.
Absolutely. And if you watch that, anyone that can look at this press conference, by the way, it's abundantly all over the web. You can find it anywhere out there. If you watch it closely, that body language, the facial expressions, these are men that are under duress. These are men that are not happy. These are men that are very, very displeased with the fact that they're on the spot being asked difficult questions about, in particular, when one member of the press said, well, tell us about the stars, you know, and then they couldn't recall seeing any. Well, that's absolutely preposterous, but you could tell that they were under a great deal of
I agree, Dennis, because there's no atmosphere on the moon. You should have seen billions of stars as tiny points of light, not diffused, not twinkling, which is done by our atmosphere, since the moon has none. But the heavens should have been ablaze with stars. It should have been one of the most, maybe the most spectacular scene ever witnessed by the eyes of man.
And the secondary thing is that you could not be transfixed by looking back the other direction towards Earth. At a much larger, like I said, per the ratio, the Earth would have been a much more prominent piece of turf out there in the sky. You couldn't possibly not see it. And you'd just be transfixed by the beauty of not just the stars in abundance, but the Earth itself. So all the lies and BS about, well, you couldn't see it because the moon is so bright, that's utter hog snot, and it doesn't wash. It doesn't work. You pan a camera up into the sky, you couldn't possibly not see the stars. That's the end of the story. And when you look at many NASA videos and photos and stuff like that, vehicles in transit in space, there's no stars. Give me a break, folks. That's the most ludicrous and stupid concept anybody could ever come up with, but per many of our observations, they couldn't possibly show us the stars, because any competent astronomer with any knowledge whatsoever could immediately find the position of the observer by what was visible in the sky above. So that's the fundamental reason why they didn't dare show us any stars.
Yeah, that's very good, Dennis. Yeah, I mean, sailors have been navigating by the stars, you know, as long as mankind has gone to sea. And I mean, the study of the constellations goes back thousands of years, all mythology built around them because of their invariant relationship to one another. You get these structures in the heavens for which elaborate stories have been created that are manifest in ancient Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and other forms of religion. It's a fascinating history, but it's peculiar in the extreme that they should claim that all they encountered was blackness. Now, one of the reasons for their grim visage may be exemplified by the third fact here, namely, rumor has it that Apollo 12 astronaut Pete Conrad was going to go public about faking the moon landings on the 30th anniversary back in July of 1999, but was killed in a motorcycle accident 1 week earlier. This reminds me of Gus Grissom, Dennis, who of course had a little hanging image of a lemon on his desk because he thought the whole thing was such a shoddy program.
Right, and he was such a vocal a mouthpiece for the fact that none of the hardware even met even the most wildest expectations that it could possibly be used to fly to another planet, let alone the moon. But it's quite clear that he and the other two astronauts in the Apollo 1 capsule were murdered, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it appears that whenever one of these guys got enough gonads to actually speak out, and Grissom, by the way, was portrayed in The Right Stuff, Tom Wolfe's movie, as being an incompetent bozo, when in fact he was anything but that. He is a very competent aviator.
Yeah, absolutely. And he seemed to have understood better, had a more accurate assessment of the state of the program than others. Here's an interesting fact, Dennis, the fourth here. It takes the space shuttle 66 hours to reach the International Space Station. which is only 200 miles above Earth, and yet NASA claims that Apollo 13 was 55 hours into its duration from liftoff when it encountered a problem at a distance of 200,000 miles. That's 1,000 times further away in less time than it takes to get to the space station.
Well, here, yeah, they can easily cite these goofy numbers, figuring that nobody on the Earth has a slapstick or a calculator and can sit down and look at velocities accurately, like some scientists actually have done, and proven unequivocally that we didn't go because the velocities of the rockets in every single launch were wrong. They never achieved the necessary velocity to loft 48 tons of payload, which is exactly what the full all-up complement of the vehicle was to the moon. It couldn't do it with the speeds they achieved.
Well, let's look at a few others, Dennis. Here, NASA had not perfected the lunar landing craft in time for Apollo 11. In 2016, they're still trying to get a rocket to land and take off again over 47 years after Apollo was supposed to have done just that. That's a rather devastating fact.
Right. You know, why would you have to reinvent the wheel, for goodness sakes? If by the way, the one thing that we want to talk about here is that the mission planner at NASA, his last name starts with a K. I'm trying to remember, Kranich or whatever it was. But anyway, he had cited many problems with the fact that none of the astronauts in over 1,200 hours of practice in the simulator could accomplish a single solitary non-crash landing on the moon in the simulator. And as you might be aware of the fact that the jet-powered simulator that was built to simulate a landing on the moon was balled up in a fiery crash, and that Armstrong literally barely got away with his life because he waited to the very last moment to eject. And after that, nobody bothered to use it anymore. And he was very insistent that they continue to practice with it if they were going to continue it. And furthermore, he had made a very astute statement. He said that he had 1 in 2 chances, possibly, and I think he was very optimistic with that he could possibly even carry it off. So this is very apparent that when you talk about the fact that we hadn't successfully been able to do it in a simulator, why would you launch a whole entire crew with the possibility that at least 2 of the gentlemen on the mission would be killed instantly on a crash landing? That's absurdity to me.
Nice point. Film footage taken inside the capsule of all Apollo missions shows a light blue haze and curvature of Earth through capsule window when they were supposedly halfway to the moon and in the blackness of space. This proves that the capsule was only in Earth orbit.
Right. And by the way, with the funny thing happened on the way to the moon by Bart Sibrel, where they actually show that footage that NASA did not want the general public to see this hoaxing going on, but it's clear that they shot it from the other side of the command module through the hole. In other words, the hole was used
through a portal.
The portal. And
because the portal, of course, was round, they were relatively close to Earth. It created the false impression that you were looking at the totality of Earth as a sphere. But when the camera pulls back, you see you're just looking through a portal.
Right, and furthermore, anybody that's an accomplished aviator that's flown above the Earth, even at heights of 30,000 feet, you can tell that what weather patterns look like from a distance. And any pilot out there with a commercial rating that's flown in high altitude aircraft could easily look at the weather that you could see through that portal and know that that wasn't possibly a whole shot of the Earth, that it was fractional, because the way it manifests itself in the shape of the weather patterns in the clouds. So, the general public wouldn't see this, but an accomplished aviator take one look at it and go, "Gee, this is so fake." It's absurd that they got away with it then, and it's absurd that they even somehow managed to release the footage that showed that they hoaxed halfway to the moon at a point when they should have been in lunar orbit already, orbiting the moon already on the 18th and the 19th.
Here's another. Moon pictures on NASA's websites are fake with backdrop scenes pasted. The pictures reveal a black line penciled in where background meets daylight sky, which was blacked out completely.
Yeah, it gets even worse. On some photographic analysis we'll look at here deeper into this show that we're doing. With great painstaking work that's been done by some people that are really experts in the field of photography, you can clearly see that it was shot in a studio, and at the furthest object in the field of vision is approximately 100 meters in distance, and it's a concave shape inside of a projection screen that they were showing us during all the stuff that they showed. But we'll get into that later.
This is especially interesting, Dennis, that the LM used on later missions was of the same specs exactly as the first mission with no modifications. It would therefore have been impossible to carry the rover vehicle to the moon in the same confined LM, even if it collapsed into a more compact form.
Yes, and the thing that I'll go so far as to state, I thought about this the other day, is that they only manufactured one. They didn't go to the trouble of making multiples for each of these missions. In other words, it's the same one used over and over again, which is impossible because we couldn't have possibly brought the whole thing back. But if you were to do a very careful examination of certain parts of the LEM, you probably could zoom in and find surface detail on the surface of the LEM that proved to you that that's the same exact vehicle over and over again, and that Grumman wasn't building multiple ones for multiple missions, that they only manufactured one and one only. And they might be able to fake the documentation now in the aftermath that they built more than one, but the people that were aware of what was going on at Grumman, if they're still alive today, could probably state for the record that they only manufactured one. They wouldn't need to make multiples because they didn't go more than once. They didn't even go once.
Needless to say, manufacturing fake documents is an area of specialization for the CIA. My understanding, by the way, Dennis, is actually that NASA is subsumed within the broader umbrella of the CIA.
Yes, it's just another branch of Central Intelligence Agency, and NASA apparently had to be created to make the world believe that we had a position of supremacy over the Russians, who had an almost immediate, way above us, command of space travel to the degree that they were the experts. And
yes. I remember Sputnik. I mean, I remember the great consternation that the Russians the Soviets were ahead of us in space and technology. So that the decision, attributed to JFK of landing, man on the moon within the decade, was a nice, wishful thinking. I have to say, Dennis, that in my opinion, Jack Kennedy was such an honest man that if he'd understood that it was technically impossible to get there, that there was no way we could do it, he would have been very honest, open, and candid with the American people and not sought to mislead or deceive the world.
Yes, I think that the problem, the biggest with the president, Mr. Kennedy, was that he didn't understand the science, the major obstacles that would prevent us from going. And if anybody would have taken him aside and said, it's a very noble cause that you cite, this is a possible thing for us to do, that we can't really leave, we can't get there. And if he would have understood that, I don't think he would have gone to such elaborate lengths to make a speech, other than the fact that I think his main goal in life was to maybe rally American people around a common goal to achieve, and that was commendable. But when you make it a mission impossible, that you can't possibly achieve it.
Yes, Dennis, your voice has been lost here momentarily.
I love Lucy.
Yeah. Well, this is a fascinating one that really is consonant with the other points you've been making. To wit, the lunar rover had inflatable tires, which would have exploded if pre-inflated, and there was no air on the moon to inflate them. Pro-Apollo nutters claimed the rover had solid wire mesh tires, yet yes, the rover in the museum had those fitted in the mid-70s when they realized pneumatic tires could not have functioned on the moon. NASA has had over 47 years to clear up the plainly obvious mistakes within the Apollo program. Each time someone brings up a query, NASA corrects it and says nothing. They can't say why the anomaly was there in the first place. I have pictures of the rover supposedly on the moon. It has the same tires and air valves as the ones they use at KSC. In other words, it's the same one. Early close-up pictures of the rover on the internet have changed since the blunder was exposed on this website.
Sure, and they've had plenty of time to fix this stuff. By the way, what NASA's been doing lately, because of the stereoscopic analysis that's being done to look at the parallax views of all these the pieces of photography that they allegedly did, which we'll talk about it's impossible that they got any pictures. But when you look at all this stuff, they've been carefully pulling down images and fixing them, and then if they're beyond repair, they just leave them offline. There's far less out there available for you to download that hasn't been monkeyed with. And they've done a great deal of work to retouch a lot of photography.
Well, my understanding is that thousands of moon photographs have disappeared from the website, Dennis, and which is simply absurd if it was real, but makes tremendous sense if it was fake.
Right, and like I said, they've been doing what they could to try and fix the obvious mess ups that they've made by releasing stuff that could be under analysis and be proven to be fake, which is almost every single. I can't see a single photograph that I've looked at yet that doesn't have some version of clear signs of fakery, like shadows running in different directions, camera cursors that are behind objects when they should always be in the forefield. The list goes on and on and on and on. Brightly lit astronauts in shadows. You can't get any more ludicrous than the fakery that they committed.
I know, it's ridiculous. Well, here's an article entitled "The Wrong Stuff" in Wired magazine back in 1994. Are you sure we went to the moon 25 years ago? Are you positive? Millions of Americans believe the moon landings may have been a $25 billion swindle perpetrated by NASA with the latest in communications technology and the best in special effects. Wired plunges into the combat zone between heated conspiracy believers and exasperated NASA officials. I mean, I'm telling you, Dennis, it has been going on as quite a battle, but the whole thing is simply an argument, appeal to authority on the one hand and to evidence, facts, and science on the other.
Right. It seems like whenever you listen to the NASA mouthpieces that rebut the cogent and very solid arguments, the only thing they can resort to is saying, "Well, of course we went," and anybody that believes this is not sane or nuts. They're kooks.
Yes.
They resort to rank ad hominems. They wouldn't have to do that if they actually had real science to back up the assertion. So they have to resort to the very most based accusations about the integrity of the people that believe that we didn't go.
That point was nicely illustrated when the Huffington Post recently had an article entitled "A Brilliant Tweet by Famous Physicist Demolishes Moon Landing Hoax Theories." And the tweet, Dennis, when I took a look, was anyone who thinks we didn't go to the moon needs to have their head examined. I mean, that wasn't even interesting. I mean, it was pure ad hominem. And interesting because of the research I'd already done, I began posting arguments about, having shadows in two directions when there should only be one source, the flag that shouldn't be waving, reflections of light in the dark side of the lander, a whole host like that. And to my astonishment, HuffPost didn't take it down, but they allowed it to continue. Or by far the most interesting was from a guy who said he was in television communications at the time. And in order to broadcast, he's talking about 1969, 70. He said in order to broadcast then, you'd need a van the size of a bread truck. And he was unaware that there were any such vehicles on the surface of moon.
Right. The issue here, when you look at the fact that we have so many photographs, by the way, that they've taken, to completely ignore the fact that the radiation would have completely whited out every single one of them.
Yes.
Before they could be returned to the Earth. In other words, they would have had a bunch of white that would have shown virtually no images because of the radiation.
Photography. That's such a telling point, Dennis. That photography on the moon would have been impossible because of radiation, because exposure to cosmic rays. I mean, it would be impossible. And then the variations in temperature from like 350 above to 350 below, and the cameras, Dennis, which of course were mounted external to the spacesuits. You couldn't even focus or frame them, and yet every single moon photograph is perfectly framed. I mean, it's completely ridiculous.
Right, the astronauts couldn't even see through a viewfinder.
Right.
And how did they so perfectly get the shot? You know, it's absurd. And then, like you say, because of the temperature differentials, the life support system on the suit would have by necessity had to have been hooked up to the camera to maintain proper temperature stabilization to protect the film inside.
That's so ridiculous, it's beyond belief. So here's, we're talking about the movie by Bart Sabrell, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, showcasing newly discovered behind-the-scenes outtakes from the first mission to the moon, proving the crew never left Earth orbit. I thought he did a brilliant job with it.
Yeah, so for a 46-minute piece of work, it's so exemplary. It goes just long enough to give you all the tools that you need to use to understand that this is a complete utter hoax and that they went to great lengths to fake it. And the documentary I mentioned already, Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon, is chock full of many, many more arguments, including illustrations that when the astronauts are walking on the moon and it seems to be an effect of the lower gravitational field being only 1/6 as great as that on Earth, that if you simply speed it up, you see they're walking is perfectly normal. And there are other cases where the astronaut is being lifted up by using a crane. In some cases, you can actually see the cable does. I mean, it's embarrassing that so much of this done was such an amateurish way. In one video, the cable actually knocks a piece of the fake backpack that's part of the life support system for the astronaut off of his back. It lands on the lunar surface, and both astronauts look at it like, uh-oh.
What do we do now?
Yeah. What do we do now? Do we get it out? Do we break out the super glue and put it back on, or what? You know, that's the apparent reaction that you got there.
Here's this nice quote from Matthew 10:26. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed in relation to Bart Sabrell's film. But I do say, if anyone wants to get serious about it, there it is right there, the second on the list on the right. You got what happened on the moon, analysis of the lunar photography, and second, conspiracy theory, did we land on the moon? This is completely brilliant, and apparently it's even shorter than Bart Sabrell since it's only 43:51.
Yeah, it's a very, like I said, it packs a lot of punch, and anybody that could watch it end to end without being a doofus, they paid attention to it. They couldn't walk away from watching that without understanding we never went. It's crystal clear that we never went.
At the time that this image was taken of Bart Sabrell's, it had over 1 million views. I would think that's relatively modest, all things considered. But here's another nice piece of proof of fakery, Dennis. You got 4 images. There's a 4-image take. I only captured 2. How's it possible the footprints and rocks seen in several of these, including on the left, have disappeared on the right? I mean, where's the footprint there, Dennis? You notice it right there, and almost 2/3 of the way down in the center, but it's on the right. What happened to the footprint?
Actually, all I can see right now is the screenshot of there's nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, so I can't see the shot you're referencing.
Oh, really, Dennis?
Yeah, that's all I'm able to see on my screen.
Huh. That's interesting. Let me go back. Okay, now I'm going to come forward. Do you see it now?
No, nothing has changed. I can see you on the right-hand side. Okay, now I can see the picture that you're talking about. AS 1582 11 11 140 and
right.
141.
Right.
Okay, now we're on the same page.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well, notice on the left-hand side, you have this footprint down there by the rocks, and on the right, it's missing. I mean, how's that possible? How do footprints and rocks disappear on the moon? This was in sequence. This was the photograph on the right was taken after the photograph on the left.
All right, that's pretty good brushing it away with a broom or something to get rid of the footprint that they didn't want to be seen. And you'd think that unless there was a specific reason why they'd want to get rid of it, they wouldn't monkey around with it. But the reason that they had to go to extreme lengths is that there were footprints, and we'll see one of them later, that can't possibly be from an astronaut's boot. In other words, it's from somebody else's shoe, and it's a terrestrial shoe. It's not a spacesuit shoe.
And it just might be a tennis shoe?
Yes, it very well looks like a tennis shoe foot.
Okay, here we got a nice moon rover. Talk about that, Dennis, because it seems to me there are no tracks before or behind suggesting it was put down using a crane.
Right, now I'm still looking at the same two photos side by side, no rover yet, but I know that picture well because when you look at it very closely, it's impossible for that lunar rover to be just sitting there in the middle of nowhere without having rolled to that position from another place. In other words, it couldn't possibly be there with no tracks. Yet it is, and that absolutely positively certifies that it was placed by a crane.
You've got the image now, Dennis?
No, I still don't have it.
You still don't have it?
All I see is the two side-by-side shots where the missing footprint has been gotten. Now I see the rover completely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, okay, and you look at it real close. By the way, you can see that there's just enough monkey business in this photograph here, where, for lack of a better term, the texture in the lower right-hand half of the picture radically changes in a way that doesn't work for me. In other words, you can tell that that's not the only monkey business in that photograph showing a lunar rover that couldn't possibly have gotten there without being driven, and yet it's sitting there all by itself. You know, that's completely preposterous. There's no tracks in any direction. How did it get there? Did the astronauts pick it up and carry it? You know.
Here's another. Now, can you see this, Dennis? This is a close-up of tracks in the. Do you have that one?
No, I'm still looking at the rover by itself, and now we're back to the shot with the. Now you're back to the rover again.
No, I'm kind of forward to the footprint. Okay. Let me see if I can get it for you, Dennis.
All right. Some of these pictures I'm very intimately familiar with.
Yeah. Well, this is a circle around a footprint, which I think you've identified as not being a boot print from the astronauts, but a tennis.
Yeah, this one, absolutely. None of these men were wearing tennis shoes, clearly, on the surface of the moon, for a number of reasons. The tennis shoe just doesn't work. It's not airtight. Probably many. The other thing that I wanted to point out, on the surface of the moon, there's no way to dissipate heat. So in direct sunlight, the surface of the lunar landscape would be many, many hundreds of degrees. In other words, you'd almost have to do the gecko walk, alternately lifting your feet back and forth to keep your feet from burning up.
Nice point.
Are apparently not moving at all, you know, or they are very slowly. They're not concerned, but there's no way that they could possibly have not felt the heat from the lunar surface coming up to their boots. And the material that the boots are made out of is a polymer that under any person's estimation it would have turned into gooey gum exposed to temperatures like this, and yet it didn't. So that's another giveaway that it's.
Do you see the boot print, the tennis shoe print at this point, Dennis?
Yeah, it's quite clear that that's not the same type of footprint. It's quite wrong. It's incorrect.
You do see it now.
Yeah, it's in the circle.
Good, excellent. Okay, here's one I know you want to talk about, a reflection in the space helmet.
Okay, now we seem to have lost audio between you and me, and I'm on a frozen screen with the footprint in it. But your face just changed on the side, so there's.
Well, let me see what I can do, Dennis, to get you with.
Okay, now we're with the face shield and the cursor.
Yes. Talk about that, Dennis.
Well, you know, the thing that's really interesting is that if you look at the different shadows going in different directions, the LEM is throwing a shadow predominantly from right to left across the screen.
Yes, it is.
And then you look at the astronaut allegedly taking this picture, his shadow intersects with it if you could extend it up there.
That's right, and you wouldn't have to extend it very far, right?
And just a little bit to the left, there's some, I don't know if it's an artifact processing, but it's yet another shadow that breaks it. So all the way across the board, we have some real problems with this picture.
Just to remind the audience, there's only supposed to be one source of light on the moon, namely the sun, so that all shadows should be perpendicular, given that the sun is such immense distance away from moon. So the fact that you have, in relatively close proximity, shadows that are not parallel, that are actually intersecting, is proof positive of more than one source of light on Moon, which is impossible if we actually were there.
The best part here is when you look at the two landing gear struts that are visible in the shot, the shadows coming off of them are almost at right angles with each other. It's crazy. It's so ludicrous.
It's this is actually quite a sensational photograph, Dennis.
Yeah, it's proof of fakery all the way across
and you see the X right there, that the cameras had X's etched on their lenses, supposedly for framing, but nobody could actually frame them. But there they are. You see it in this photograph.
Right, and the interesting thing is, if it's actually, we're taking a picture with the Hasselblad pointed at this helmet, looking at a reflection, but why are we not able to see that the crosshair on the cursor, right, going right down to the edge of the helmet itself? Because that's exactly where it would be. It's.
Dennis, yeah, continue, yeah.
So I was mentioning that the cursor on the Hasselblad should come down on the outside of on the surface of the outside of the helmet.
So it should be curved. It should be curved.
Well, sure, it should be, because it's a reflection. It would be it would reflect just in the same.
Yeah, it should be curved on the curved surface of the helmet. So this
put it on there.
Dennis, this one photograph is absolutely devastating to the whole hoax.
Right, you can see that they added the cursor, but they didn't realize that it would have to be distorted,
right,
because it's on a curved surface. But it's not.
Right.
It should also be on the It should be on the frame of the helmet, and it's not there. It's on the inside of the helmet, like the cursor. The Houston so stupid that they did it like this. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, some of these fakers aren't very good. For example, when the prosecution of Zoker Saranova for the Boston bombing, which he had nothing whatsoever to do with, they produced as evidence a confession he'd allegedly written on the inside of a boat, which was made out of fiberglass, and the confession they presented was perfectly straight, uniformly spaced lines, Dennis, and it's being written on the curved surface of the inside of a boat, and because it's made of fiberglass, it presumes a special implement to write on fiberglass. Does anyone think that Zoker Saranova just happened to have one of these special implements to write on the inside of a fiberglass boat?
Oh, sure. He has superhuman powers to keep it straight.
Yes, it's so stupid. So much of this stuff is so insulting.
But they know that you can get away with it because the American public isn't bright enough to spot it instantly. Like this picture, we've already called out 7 or 8 different artifacts, including the camera cursor, that prove totally beyond any reasonable doubt that it's fake and artificial. It's not reality. And
I think this is devastating. Let's take the next. Let's pick it up here. Do you see the lem in space?
Yep, I'm looking at it now. And the issue here that I have with the surfaces is that in direct sunlight, what you'd be doing with all these black surfaces, you'd be making them extremely hot in comparison to a relatively cooler surface. But the other thing that's inexplicable, and we'll talk about it when we see a couple more images, is that they went crazy with the gold foil everywhere in places where it doesn't make any sense, and then they're using it predominantly to reflect heat. Fundamental reason why it's there in the first place. But then they go to extreme lengths to put the black absorbing surfaces that make the situation even worse for the crew inside this vehicle in space in direct sunlight.
Frankly, this thing looks like a piece of junk.
It's probably comprised fundamentally of cardboard and construction paper more than metal. I can't prove it, but you might want to have a frame that's moderately robust. But all these crinkly surfaces and stuff like that show that this crap was put together hastily, almost like in somebody's garage. It wasn't done in a.
Dennis, here's another.
But I think they could take this to the lunar environment.
Here's another. Do you have the next image?
Yeah, I'm looking at the LEM, the one that I marked up this image extensively in the past to show no blast cone, nothing's disturbed underneath. The lander pads are completely free of any dust. The thing that's mostly striking here is that they've inexplicably once again put this very, very, very dark black heat absorbing crap all over the outside of the LEM in places where you wouldn't want it. As we've ascertained, we don't use any gas springs or shock absorbers that are made with in any way, make, or form with a gas chamber on them on the landing gear at all. Those are not used. They use a totally different type with a honeycomb absorber to absorb landing, and that's another matter I hope we get to talk to deeper in. But this ad hoc placement of the black crap versus the reflective foil for temperature control, it doesn't make any sense other than the fact that it's very pretty and it mesmerizes people. By the way, when you look at that little bulge sticking out of the side of the LEM, it reminds me of the old days when you had an old television set. If you looked in the back of it, it had a little cone sticking out for the neck of the CRT sticking out in the back of the set, that they had to make the bulge to accommodate that neck. But this whole thing looks, nobody at NASA can explain with any sense why they put heat absorbing material all over the base of this thing in places that don't make any sense, and they went to such great lengths to put reflective foil for temperature control on something like the lander pads. Why would you need to temperature control the very pads that sit down on the moon? They're metal. They should be able to withstand even an 800 degree the transition, because the lunar surface is going to be hot. It can't possibly be cool. Everybody says, well, it's cold in space. Well, it might be, but not on a direct sunlight illuminated surface that's been there hour after hour after hour in sunlight when you touch down on it. So I don't understand.
This just looks like a piece of junk to me again, Dennis. It's ridiculous.
But the optical effect here is to get you all wrapped around the axle about the contrast between the black and the reflective foil. Most of this crap that they have wrapped around the base of this vehicle could have not even been there. I'd go so far as to say that they probably wasted probably 100 pounds in extra weight that they could ill afford to take to the moon for absolutely no reason to create an optical illusion and fakery here.
Here's another close-up of one of the landing pads that's a little out of focus.
Right, I had to blow it up, but you can see that the Hasselblad built into the camera cursor is behind the strut, which is physically not possible.
Right. It has to be in front of it. It can't be behind it. It's actually on the lens of the camera. It's etched into the lens of the camera.
That's right. It's part of the camera itself, and it's behind the object, which absolutely certifies more fakery again, that was a photoshopped image, and they didn't think anybody would catch it. But many of these images, by the way, if you look at them close and study these cursors, you're going to find them behind objects in your field of view. That's not possible. It's in the camera.
Right, it's on the lens of the camera, absolutely. Here's another, Dennis. Now, do you see this one?
Yeah, the LEM sitting there with the rover next to it.
Yeah, tell us about this.
Well, when you look at this this imagery, it's here again. You got.
Is this like the placenta from giving birth to the rover? There, you see that on the right below the flag. I mean, this is bizarre, Dennis. And again, look how much of it is dark.
Right. And the thing that you probably would note if you could look at it closer, and you can't really see it in this photo, is there's probably no tracks between the base of the LEM and where the lunar rover is physically sitting, which means that it just materialized there after it was disgorged, which is another mystery how it got transported approximately 10 feet or more from the base of the LEM without leaving tracks, because it would have had to have been assembled right there where it came out of all the material that it was wrapped up in when it was moved out of the side of it. Now we have another picture that's not visible here, but you can actually see the lunar rover coming out. It's still packed up, coming out of the base of the LEM, and there are tire tracks already on the lunar surface from it. Which is
not here, but they're not here. And notice here in the foreground, in the bottom left, Dennis, that's a lunar rover track. I mean, that has to be.
Well, yeah, but
look how inconsistent they are, Dennis. Look how they're inconsistent. They're not equally distributed for the distance between the wheels. Look at the lower right. I mean, this is a mess.
The thing that's interesting here, this is very, very amazing, is that we have once again a shadow almost directly underneath the lunar the LEM itself, and which means that we should be looking at the shadow zone on this side of the LEM, and yet it's brightly lit by another source of light, which shouldn't be taking place at all. And this time we don't have shadows running in every other direction, but the shadows appear to be almost directly indicating that the sun is directly over the top of everything. And
Right.
and given that, it's a little bit troubling because we have antennas on top of the limb. I don't know if you look at the parabola there in front of the limb. That should be throwing a reflection or a shadow a little bit further out into the dirt. It's not there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of peculiar looking, but this particular picture here, with no sign of any stars again, is very problematic from the standpoint that no matter what NASA wants to say about the contrast levels and the optics, and they make all these excuses, you'd see stars out there every single time, and they're just not there. So I'd like them to explain away how you could pan the camera directly straight up at the apex, away from the lunar surface, and not see stars. It would be preposterous not to. It's ludicrous to presume that we couldn't.
Now, this next image is from Jack White, where he was observing that there's...
Yeah, we're looking at the limb here that I marked up. This is the one that I think this photograph you used in your book. I think they killed our audio.
Right. This
is that probable?
Jack White's work, where there's no blast out rocket motor exhaust crater. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing. It looks like somebody threw down some Ronsinol lighter fluid and then lit it to make the little round thing. You know, but other than that, there's no sign that this thing. And by the way, this engine was firing all the way to the lunar surface, folks. Because by the way, they've edited the recording to where you don't hear the astronaut stipulate that he has just now shut the engine off after landing, and that's absurd in and of its own right. Because after you've already touched down, if the engine were still firing, you'd be going right straight back up again. You know. In other words, his timing to make the declaration that he shut the engine off was wrong by any stretch, and we'll talk about that more. But there's no sign that any dust has been disturbed. When you look at the crystal clear pictures of this shot, which this is not, you'd have dust all over the base of all those black surfaces because they're not shiny and they're not smooth. They appear to be like black construction paper taped to the back or to the vehicle. Including some of these black shrouds that are wrapped around the struts in some places, for no apparent reason anybody can explain. But you'd have dust everywhere. The foot pads of the lander, in every single case, would be completely full of dust, and they're not. But the little tiny pebbles, by the way, directly underneath this cone, you can't really see. There's no sign that the pebbles were even disturbed. You see little indications that they rolled a little bit in the dust and they didn't move. They didn't do anything.
And if anyone thinks this isn't telling, compare it to this drawing, Dennis, in the next slide, where they actually show a blast crater there.
Yeah, and they do this over and over again. They show there's many illustrations. By the way, this isn't something that we put together. This is a NASA publication.
NASA manual for training purposes only. Page 24 is dated May 1969. So this is.
And the other thing I want to point out is they so very cogently showed that the lander pad has actually disturbed the lunar dust as well, and that's absolutely missing.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. That the pad has also disturbed the dust. Nice, acute observation, Dennis.
Yeah, it settled down into the dust as it would.
I know. I love it.
But the dust shouldn't be there in the first place, you know, with all that engine plume that would have been there.
Right, should have cleared the area completely, right. Well, here's about NASA plans giant deep space rocket. There's a lot here to talk about, Dennis. Do you see the image?
Right, yep. And it shows the different relative size of the vehicles and what they're gonna take. But I think that here again, if they're going anywhere beyond 200 miles, we're talking fantasy, because there's no provision for the necessary shielding to protect the astronauts on board from deadly interstellar radiation from the sun.
By the way, just to confirm, you got the beeping light right for the recording going on.
That's correct. It's still blinking.
Good. Well, you know, I've searched in vain now for something I saw in the past, which was that Wernher von Braun originally had a sketch of the spaceship necessary to travel to the moon. And it was 3 times the size of the Empire State Building, and he suggested we need at least 3 of them.
Right, and they'd have to be assembled in Earth orbit. They couldn't. They wouldn't be launchable from the surface of the Earth because of the huge amount of power that they'd require to get to the velocities to get there. And by the way, the one diagram that I looked at, the crew on board, notwithstanding the astronauts, was a team of approximately 20 or more engineers to run the systems on a ship of that magnitude. And that's what he initially proposed. And of course, the people at NASA said, "Oh, no, 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 we can't do that. That's beyond our undertaking." So we had to scale it back. And what they did, they scaled it back to a vehicle that literally couldn't lift all this weight to the lunar surface. We'll get into that deeper into the discussion.
Yes. And of course, this is a diagram about this deep space rocket. They're comparing it with Saturn V, 67 to 73, with a space shuttle, 81 to 2011. That this SLS is supposed to be launched by the end of 2017. Do you have any idea where in the world we'd be in relation to this project?
Well, the thing is that NASA's budget, if you were to look at it real closely, they're probably using both sides of the toilet paper about now over there because their budget's been cut way back. And it seems like the thing they have to spend money on now is getting better seals for the helmets to keep the water in the swimming pool out. But we'll get into that too. We have to talk about the fakery. But they don't have the budget to build a rocket of that magnitude. Now we're looking at von Braun's diagrams of his vehicles to go to the moon. They're quite different than what we actually allegedly used, are they not?
Yeah. In fact, I'm kind of puzzled because here's a guy who really knew what he was talking about. Why didn't they follow his models in mocking up, what they were going to use here and faking it? That would have been much more plausible.
Right. And what they didn't think is that they didn't feel that there were enough people in America that would go, how could we do this so quickly? And most Americans don't realize that there's very rigid and stringent qualification testing to verify your design, temperature, shock, vibration, electromagnetic compatibility. All these things would have taken a great deal of time. And if you have to go back to the drawing board and make a change, you start all over again. You don't just presume that your science was right, because when I took a close look at the diagrams that Grumman put forth, how they built the lunar excursion module, quite frankly, with my extensive background in shock and vibration and temperature, there's stuff doesn't work for me. And if we were to go into a lab today and replicate the conditions on the surface of the moon, the temperature extremes and the type of temperatures we get inside the LEM, those guys would have been cooked like chickens in a broiler. They had no way to get the heat out of the vehicle, and that's a whole other matter. But I looked at these drawings extensively for apparatus that would allow them to do it. There's virtually none. The designs are completely wholly inadequate. Anybody with any physics and design background that from actually building and testing objects to withstand high temperature environments and cold and stuff like that would take one look at it and dismiss it offhand as being foolish and goofy. And yet, on the very first iteration of all this stuff, like you mentioned earlier, the lunar excursion module and didn't change one bit. It didn't change. And you'd think after the very first mission that they would have had what we call a wash-up in military terms, where you sit down and talk about the things that you did wrong, and then you'd incorporate all those new changes into the new design, which once again means you go back to the drawing board to revalidate some of the stuff. If you make any extensive changes to the vehicle, you got to make sure that you didn't make a change that detriments, makes a problem for you with the rest of the system. So you can't arbitrarily assume that even a minor change won't have serious ramifications on the rest of the vehicle and its capability to perform. And yet we don't have any extensive proof that they did any environmental testing at all. NASA doesn't have chambers where they have mock-ups sitting in there where they did thousands, if not maybe 2 or 3 years of testing to validate the designs. They did none of this, and they got it all right on the very first attempt. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't work like that. When you really have a complex effort like this, all the odds are in the favor of this thing being a horrendous failure from any number of standpoints, but fundamentally from a temperature control standpoint and radiation control standpoint.
Here are details of the cabin for the von Braun lunar lander. But look how much more elaborate that is, Dennis. That thing's huge. I mean, it's like a 4 or 5 story apartment.
Right, and when you look at the fact that the hull is significantly thicker, my guess is that von Braun understood that the radiation problem would be a big showstopper, and that they made some attempts to do 2 things there. First off, insulate the vehicle properly so that the temperature control stuff would be under control, but also to protect the crew from micrometeorite incursions. On a trip of this nature, 230,000 miles one way, you'd at least encounter some micrometeorite strikes that would have punctured the hull, and required NASA to have a method to quickly and easily plug the hole so that they didn't bleed out into space and lose the atmosphere.